Starting from the bottom of B tier, we have Hibiki. Just a quick disclaimer before we begin. Just because I rank a certain character above another one, does not mean that the character rated below is unplayable, or on the contrary, that you have to play the character that's above him. This game is a roguelite after all, and any character can be viable with the right build. However, some characters will objectively and invariably be better than others. When I was writing the ranking for these characters, I always started with what they're good at and then started moving on to the cons. Hibiki is very good at keeping enemies at bay via his glaive orbit, and some of his potentials, when you fully upgrade them, aren't even that bad in terms of damage. However, Hibiki struggles with the syndrome of having only a few worthwhile potentials. And because he has a very bad selection of potentials, it leads to a very repetitive playstyle, where you just spam the same potential over and over again. Granted, you're not required to play like that, but you really ought to, considering that his potential selection is just so bad. And even if you do this, you have a smaller reward than some other characters on this list. Hibiki's SP skill is also just objectively one of the worst in the game. Its damage output is not great, and building SP back up takes forever, because Hibiki builds it by hitting enemies in the back, which is not always as easy as you might think. In terms of certain worthwhile potentials that he has, Oblivion Glaive at max level is basically almost a necessity. Staggering Cuts is pretty great, although arguably a bit brainless at max potential. And the dash, specifically the one that turns his dash into a whirlwind roll when glaives are active, is pretty damn good. The rest of the potentials are not too much to talk about, and honestly you can just forget they exist. Next up, we have Noel, and immediately this is a huge jump in quality compared to Hibiki. Starting with the upsides, Noel has fantastic SP generation speed. Since a lot of her skills that cost MP are AoE and attack very quickly, she can generate SP at a superb rate. And since a lot of her skills are AoE, she's very good at stun locking enemies. In fact, she's one of the best users of the chance stun buff you can acquire. On the topic of her SP skill does comical amounts of damage if you overexhaust it all the way to the limit. This is best used on bosses, as they are mostly stationary, and you can just sort of camp while you hold down the SP button. Now to the downsides. Noel, much like Hibiki, suffers from the only a few worthwhile potentials syndrome. A lot of her potentials are just outright forgettable, but she's definitely not repetitive like Hibiki. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with Zero Gun Fenrir and Bullet Rain, which compared to Hibiki is just way more engaging, because you have much more options to use. On the topic of her MP, however, her base MP skill is terrible. You should never ever use that. You are completely stuck in place until either the animation finishes, which takes forever and it does barely any damage, or you cancel it, at which point you've just effectively wasted 50 MP for nothing. A lot of the times I used the base MP skill by accident and I had to purposely cancel it into a dash just to not use it. As mentioned before, her worthwhile potentials include Universal Enhancement, Zero Gun Fenrir or Bullet Rain, Sleipnir, which is her SP skill, and Quick Reload. And trust me, I really tried to get value out of her other potentials, but it is simply just completely not worth doing. Just stick to Zero Gun Fenrir and you'll be completely fine. At the top of B tier, we have Lambda 11. Lambda has extremely good area control with even just her base skill, and since her passive allows her to gain MP by knocking enemies on the ground, simply hitting her base skill will allow her to get most of her MP back. Lambda also has potential for exceptional air stalling. What I mean by this is that Lambda has certain potentials that allow her to stay in the air just completely frozen still, which doesn't sound too useful on paper, but when you realize that you can cancel them into jumps and dashes, it becomes pretty useful. Now we come to the downsides, however. Lambda has undoubtedly the slowest startup of all characters in the early game. Whereas Noel and Hibiki had too little potentials that are actually good, Lambda has the opposite issue. Pretty much all of Lambda's potentials are useful in their own situations, however, it is physically impossible to get all of them. And since Lambda's base kit doesn't really offer too much, Universal Enhancement fully upgraded is basically a necessity. That's already 4 potential slots that you have to use. Granted, once you have Universal Enhancement fully upgraded, she feels much better. But remember, you've already used 4 potential spaces unless you somehow manage to get 2 potentials out of the store and 2 potential spaces. To use Lambda to her fullest extent, you basically have to get every single potential space very early on, and then somehow manage to roll a potential at the store every time you go there. I don't think I need to tell you that the chances of that happening are astronomically low. Lambda's placement here in the tier list honestly kinda saddens me, simply because Lambda is a very easy fix. Simply by making some of her potentials base kit and reducing the number of potentials needed to fully upgrade certain potentials would immediately boost her up into A tier. You might have noticed that I have not mentioned Lambda's SP skill at all, and that is because Lambda doesn't have one. That's right, Lambda is the only character in this game that does not have an SP skill, and I'm not too sure why. Honestly, you could easily turn Legacy Edge, or the potential that summons a big sword from the ceiling, into an SP skill, and it would be totally fine. As I already mentioned, the worthwhile potentials are Universal Enhancement, which, again, basically a necessity, Sword Summoner EX, Sword Summoner EX Elysium, Luminous Slave EX, Legacy Edge. Honestly, most of Lambda's potentials are universally good, but the first 4 that I mentioned are her best to get very early on. Moving to the start of A tier, we have Mai. I was debating whether to exchange Mai and Lambda's positions, but after a few runs I came to the conclusion that Mai is slightly better, although she's honestly hanging here by a thread. Mai has arguably the best mobility in the entire game. Not only are her dashes and jumps extremely good, they are also lubed up in invincibility frames. And if you get the triple dash one, then you can basically cover the entire map in the span of a few seconds. And that's not even mentioning the iframes that you get from Ayanishiki. Speaking of Ayanishiki, you can use that stance to achieve comical levels of DPS if you have enough MP to spare. Mai also has surprisingly high base damage, which allows her to get started in the early game very quickly. Now onto the downsides, and oh boy are there downsides. Mai has quite possibly the second worst selection of potentials in the entire game. Now granted, she doesn't have too many potentials, but if anything that actually makes it even worse. The only potentials you need to win with this character are the stance, Ayanishiki, the dash, and the airborne attack. Take the rest of her potentials and throw them into the garbage can. Trust me when I say this, they are not at all worth running. Her SP skill is also literally just on the same level as Hibiki. The damage is very lacking, and although it covers the whole screen and does a lot of hit stun, it doesn't really kill things. Like I said, if this character didn't have iframes on half the shit she does, she would most likely be below Lambda. But because of her very high base damage and the fact that she's covered in iframes, she's arguably very slightly better than Lambda in my eyes. Next up on the list is Taaka. The colloquially called lolcat continues her shenanigans in Entropy Effect by being the most brain-dead easy character to use in the entire game. Seriously, I'm not going to dwell on this character. Just upgrade Heavy Strike to max, Spinny Spinny to max, maybe dash or jump if you're feeling spicy, and you win the entire game. Take every other potential that I have not mentioned and throw it into the fucking garbage. It is not worth running. By using just Heavy Strike and Spinny Spinny, you can beat every single boss and enemy in the entire game. Her SP skill is quite literally just a better version of Hibiki's SP, and she also gains SP back very quickly thanks to Spinny Spinny. What's the downsides, you ask? Well, the downside is that she has the single worst selection of potentials in the entire game because of this. Do not even attempt to get value out of anything other than Heavy Strike, Spinny Spinny, and maybe dash or jump. And because of this, it leads to the most brain-off style of gameplay you could possibly have in this game. You might wonder why she's so high up then, considering that she's in the same boat as Hibiki. The reason being, her damage just completely shreds enemies and bosses for some reason. I'm really glad development resources went into Taaka instead of a character like, I don't know, Hazama or even Terumi. Anyway, moving on. I never want to see this character again. At the top of A tier, we have Hakumen. Mr. Hero joins the fray, boasting the highest base damage in the game. In fact, Hakumen's base damage is almost double that of other characters, and because of this, percentage scaling for him works much better than other characters. Hakumen is also one of the only few characters in this game that have a guaranteed use case for almost every single one of his potentials. His base skill, Yukikaze, is a very easy to use, high damage get out of jail free card in a lot of situations. Seriously, this character just starts dealing insane amounts of damage after getting only a few potentials. Since his SP skill is also a parry, he can be used twice if you block an attack. And also, his SP skill just deals more damage than God himself. Being the high damage powerhouse that he is, he obviously needed some kind of drawback. And that drawback is not having an actual dodge. Yes, Hakumen can dash, but his dash is an attack with super armor. Granted, this dash does have some level of invincibility frames at the very start, but it's very minimal. Hakumen is also the slowest character in the entire game. Many of his basic attacks also cannot be cancelled into anything other than his skill, so if you run out of MP at a bad time, you're pretty much guaranteed to get hit. This also means that Hakumen is the most MP dependent character in the entire game. But the reason that he's so high up is simple. Every single one of his potentials has some use, even if it's very niche, and some potentials also remove certain drawbacks. For example, if you get the Kandachi potential that allows you to use physical attacks, also known as Renka, you can cancel any basic attack into those physical attacks and then into a dash. The physical attacks are also much faster, but still deal very good damage. Hakumen being able to attack faster while also being able to cancel it into certain things is very good for him. In terms of worthwhile potentials, Kokujin Yukigaze is almost a no-brainer. Kokujin Shippu just completely obliterates enemies. Jinrai, which is his SP skill, and Renka, which I've already talked about. But again, you could honestly argue that every single one of his potentials is good. The only potential that feels somewhat underwhelming is his universal enhancement, as all it does is just reduce damage taken while you have super armor. But even that isn't so bad, as Hakumen gains super armor on pretty much everything that he does. Finally, moving on to the S tier category characters, we're starting off with S. Shout out to small anime girls with big swords, gotta be one of my favorite genders. Now, I want you to imagine Hibiki and Lambda's skill combined into one area control skill. That is exactly what S's Crest Arts skill does. A fully upgraded Crest Arts potential basically rivals both Hibiki's and Lambda's area control while dealing much more damage than both of them combined. Her base Circle Crest basically trivializes any enemy engagement simply because they can't get close to you, and the shooter variant just completely shreds enemies. The crests that she generates also for whatever reason break defense apparently, although this isn't stated anywhere. And since S generates SP by creating and hitting with crests, she can generate SP insanely fast. Her SP skill is also one of the cheapest in the game, and it's also very easy to use. And since she can also overexhaust it, she can technically use her SP skill 4 times in a row before needing to recharge it again. Despite this, however, S also struggles from the only a few worthwhile potential syndrome. Now that would usually be bad, but for S it's almost completely inconsequential, simply because S does so much damage and has such insanely good control over the area that she almost doesn't even need any insanely strong potentials to make up for it. Her universal enhancement, crest arts, and attack potentials are more than enough what you need. Her air dash also has an interesting property where she gains a little bit of air momentum whenever she uses it, so you can technically use it as a pseudo triple jump. Another thing that S somewhat lacks is the lack of invincibility frames on a lot of attacks. But again, this is not really necessary, simply because you can just keep all the opponents away from you anyway. High base damage, combined with good area control, plus very quick SP gain and a very good SP skill, is what warrants her placement this high up on the list. The second, and only other S-tier character is Kokonoe. Now, Kokonoe is a very interesting character in this game. Kokonoe is probably the only character that has 2 distinct playstyles that you can use with her, and it completely depends on whether or not you decide to get the universal enhancement potential. Now, sadly, since the universal enhancement potential has a lot of potentials that you need to get it fully upgraded, it's much better to pick one or the other usually. And going the playstyle of just getting every single potential and ignoring universal enhancement is sadly the better option. Pretty much every single armament that she can offer you has some use to it, whether that's extremely comical amounts of hit stun or just flat out insane damage. In fact, this character is one of the few characters that once you get enough potentials, you remove every single downside that she can have. Finding her base dash a bit hard to use? Don't worry, her first potential on the dash gives her 3 completely invincible teleports. You don't like that you have to stand still to use her skill? That's fine. Just get the potential that leaves a clone after you cancel it into a dash or a jump. You don't want to let enemies play the video game? That's okay, just fully upgrade Heaven's Judgment and you win. When I was writing this character, I actually found it very difficult to find a downside to this character simply because of this issue. The only real downside that sticks with you until the end of the run is the fact that if you use her skill in the air, it's very underwhelming. It just shoots a bunch of rockets and nothing else. But if you have enough MP and you get enough potentials, you can basically stun lock the entirety of the cast. In fact, during the 3rd phase of the Susano fight, you can just use Heaven's Judgment to permanently stun lock him. I don't think I need to even explain further why this character is up here. Now we move on to the S+ category of characters. But honestly, calling it S+ is an understatement. Realistically, this category should just be labeled God tier. The first inhabitant of the S+ category is Jin. Honestly, do I even need to talk about this motherfucker? Jin has undoubtedly the strongest CC over any and all enemies, including bosses. Yes, you did hear that correctly. This guy can permanently slow and occasionally freeze bosses, including Susano, the final boss of the game. Jin has absolutely 0 bad potentials. In fact, fact, his potentials snowball out of control, and although a lot of his attacks cost MP to use, he's not extremely MP reliant as you might think. He attacks very quickly, and they also scale very well because one of his potentials essentially triples his damage output, specifically talking about the potential that upgrades any attack you do upon sheeting. Jin also has basically one of the best SPs in the entire game, simply because his SP can feed back into itself. The reason being, Jin gains SP by slowing or freezing enemies, but his SP also freezes enemies. This means that if you slow or freeze a couple enemies and then hit your SP skill, you can feed back SP into itself and be basically at 75 or even 100 SP upon using the skill. It's absolutely nuts, and I honestly don't even know what other downside this character could have other than the fact that he's somewhat slow early game, simply because Jin has the lowest base damage out of all characters, if you can believe that. But if that doesn't convince you, let's talk about Jin's passive, Time Stasis. When you successfully dodge an enemy attack, time around you slows down. Now that sounds pretty cool on paper, right? Unfortunately, what it fails to state is also the fact that while time is slowed down, you are completely invulnerable to all damage. And yes, I do mean all damage. Bear in mind, you can create any Evo type of Jin and pass this passive onto anybody else. So yes, this character is just completely busted. And yet somehow, still not as busted as the next character. And now, the character that lies at the very top, the cream of the crop, Ragna. Bold move from 91 Act, making the poster boy of the Blazblue series so good in this game. I'm not going to lie to you, this character, much like Jin, basically has no downside. Except, Ragna quite literally has no downside. This character has it all. He has damage, he has mobility, he has the best SP skill in the game. The utility of his dash attacks rivals that of Mai. He is virtually unkillable. He's the only character that doesn't require any self-sustain. All of his potentials are extremely good. He's absolutely buttered up in invincibility frames on half the stuff that he does. He can go from literal death's door all the way to 100% HP again. With just one potential, he builds SP like no other character. Like I said, there is absolutely no downside to this character. The only possible way you can die with this character is if you use a move that eats a ton of your current HP and then get hit immediately afterwards. Now, you don't have to be a genius to understand that that really rarely happens, simply because there's only two that do this, Devoured by Darkness and Black Onslaught, both of which give you invincibility frames right after it becomes active. Now you might wonder why there's technically two Jins in this game, but Ragna still is better than both of them. You see, this is because it is a universal Blazblue law that Jin has to take an L, no matter what game or series it is. So now you can be up to speed as to why that is. And that's going to do it for my ranking of the Entropy Effect characters. I would be more than happy to answer any questions you might have about my placements in the tier list in the comments. You can comment if you agree, or comment if you disagree. As always, tier lists are subjective by nature, and I'm not here to tell people what character they should play or not. If you enjoy any character from this game, keep playing them. I'm not here to tell you otherwise. This is just a simple video that I wanted to do for a long time, and I finally got the chance to do it. As always, a huge thank you to all of our channel members. Your support cannot be appreciated enough. And as always, we will see you all in the next video.